So the Albany Police Department is committed to transparency and sharing of information with the members of the public, particularly during incidents of high priority. And this is an example of that commitment to transparency. We'll be releasing portions of video from yesterday's event in a very short time frame after the event itself. So I'll show you 4 portions of video. The videos that I'll show you today will corroborate some of the messaging that I gave yesterday. They'll show that this person did in fact stab one of our officers. It'll show the de-escalation that these officers used both before and after the event, and it'll also show the events leading up to the event itself and justification for the officers having physical contact with this person. So we'll start playing the videos now, and we'll play the first 2 through in their entirety, and then I'll talk a little bit during the 3rd and 4th one.
I'm not being unruly or anything. No, I'm not going to cuffs. How you gonna go to the police station now at 9 cuffs? Why am I going to the police station? What is the warrant for? This is nothing to do with her. This is I know that. That's why I'm asking. Where is the warrant for? We're gonna go clear it up. What's the warrant for? Just keep going. They're all instruction for everything. So, bro, I just came from Schenectady County for that reason. The judge released me. That was 3 months ago. I'm not going to no cuffs for that again. You're going to have to kill me. I'm not. Listen, I'm telling you, I just went for that and they let me go through the judge, bro. You want to make a phone call? I'm not going that way. Bro, I'm not going to cuffs. Right now, I know we have it back.
All right, so that's the view from one of the officers there. Now we'll show another clip that shows the incident from another body-worn camera. But let me just give a little bit more context before we go into the second video. The officers, again, they were there for a domestic violence incident. They arrived there and they were on scene for, I believe it was close to an hour. And during that period of time, they were helping this gentleman get items from inside of the apartment that he was in, taking them outside of the apartment so that he can go someplace else. And up until that point, the encounter was cordial. And you can see from the officers talking with the person that there was nothing confrontational up until that point. And another key point, and we'll see this a little bit more in this next video that you'll see, the officers did not have physical contact with that person until he put his hands inside of a pocket in the sweatshirt that he was wearing. That's a critical point that needs to be made, because when our officers are trained, and for that matter, police officers across this country are trained, when they're dealing with individuals, particularly individuals who have made some comments that violence may be imminent, to watch the hands of those persons, because that is when they can use their hands to take items out of their pockets, or that's when they can actually hurt officers. And in these next couple of videos, we'll see that. These officers did not touch that person until they did not grab onto that person until that person placed his hands inside of that pocket. And then you will actually see the person remove the knife from his pocket and use that knife against these officers. And so we'll play this second clip, and then I'll talk a little bit more before we go to the third one.
All right? Hold on a second. All right, but you ain't gotta hold me, bro. I've been just cool with you all this time. I'm not gonna do those two. Okay, no, go ahead. All right, now. Move it in. place you in cuffs. Why? Because you have a warrant. How do I have a warrant? I don't have no warrant. I can't help but prison. Listen, I get that. Sometimes people don't clear up everything. I'm like, if I'm going to be in cuffs, I'm not being unruly or anything. That's our policy. You know, I'm not going in cuffs. How you gonna go to our police station out in cuffs? Why not go to the police station? What is the warrant for? This is nothing to do with her. No, I know that. That's why I'm asking. What is the warrant for? We're gonna go clear it up. What's the warrant for? Just be blunt. Don't touch me for anything. So, bro, I just came from Schenectady County for that reason. Just shot with 3 months ago. Here's how it works. I'm not going to no cuffs for that again. You're gonna have to kill me. I'm not. I'm telling you, I just went for that and they let me go through the judge, bro. You want to make a phone call? I'm not going in cops. No, I'm not going in cops. Bro, what you got right now? Stop it right now. I don't know what you got in your back. I don't. Watch out! Watch out! Move! Get back! Get back up! Back up! Back up! Don't worry about it. Put it down. Put it down. 201. Shots fired. Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Hurry up. Put the knife down now. 201. Shots fired. Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Choice is yours. Choice is yours. Choice is yours. Put the knife down. Put it down. Put it down now. I want to render aid. Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Put the knife down, sir.
So the third video slows it down, and we'll go slow motion now, and that's when you really get to see the moment when that person went inside of his pockets of the sweatshirt that he was wearing. And you'll also be able to see even more clearly the knife that was used, and you actually see the person swinging at the officer at that point. Now there's another video that we're not showing right now because it's too graphic at this point, and out of respect to the officer and others there, we're not showing that one at this moment, but that is the actual video that shows the officer's wounds that he sustained in this incident, and is again, it was just a very graphic wound, lots of blood, and so that one we actually are not showing. But the next one that I'll show will show the actual incident in slow motion. And again, it'll show the moment when this person reached inside of his sweatshirt and took out the knife.
Alright, hold on one second. Oh, bro. I got you. I'm like, bro, you ain't gotta hold me, bro. I've been just cool with you all this time. I'm not gonna do nothing stupid. Yeah, no, go ahead. All right, now. Over there. Now, what are we doing? Placing you in your back. Wait, what are we doing, brother? I'm placing you in cuffs. Why? Because you have a warrant. How do I have a warrant? I don't have no warrant. I can't help but prison. Listen, I get that. Sometimes people don't clear up everything. I'm like, if I'm going to be in cuffs, I'm not being unruly or anything. That's our policy. I'm not going in cuffs. How you gonna go to our police station out in cuffs? Why not go to the police station? What is the warrant for? This is nothing to do with her. No, I know that. That's why I'm asking. What is the warrant for? We're gonna go clear it up. That's the warrant for. Just be blunt. Don't touch me for anything. So, bro, I just came from Schenectady County for that reason. Just shot with 3 months ago. Here's how it works. I'm not going to no cuffs for that again. You're gonna have to kill me. I'm not.
Okay, key point here. He mentions, you are going to have to kill me. I am not going in cuffs. And the officer's immediate reactions were to diffuse, de-escalate. We understand that now this person is quite tense. And we know that there is an open and valid warrant out of our city for this person. And despite that, and despite his level of anxiety at this point, these officers are still in de-escalation mode at this point. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm telling you, I just went for that and they let me go through the judge, bro. You're going to make a phone call. I'm not going in car.
Stop it there, Steve. This is another key point right here. This is when things were cordial for the most part at this point. Yes, he's quite tense, and the officers had not made any physical contact in terms of arrest type of physical contact with this person. Here is when this whole encounter changed. At this moment, the person puts his hands inside of the pocket in his sweatshirt. That is a signal to officers anywhere, when any sorts of incidents like this, that danger is perhaps imminent. And this is when officers are on high alert, when anyone under these circumstances do what this person did, because he in fact was going inside of that pocket to take a knife out, to harm the officers. And so what you see next is the officers doing what we train our officers to do. When we're in a situation like this, tensions are a little high, and a person just unexpectedly puts their hands in their pockets, our officers are trained to gain some sort of control to protect themselves or others, and in fact, that's exactly what this officer did. Stop it there, Steve. That is at that point is really the first time that the officers in a custodial type of interaction with this person took some action. And that officer did exactly what we train our officers to do. He went inside of his pocket. Officer reached over to gain control of that person's arms and hands in case that person had a weapon and was planning to use a weapon against an officer. And again, it turned out that that is exactly what happened in this case. And here's the piece right here where the person is taking the weapon out. And as you can see there, it's the blade at that point is not out. There's some sort of a mechanism that engages and releases the blade, and you'll see in another few frames here the actual blade once it's out. But this is the moment when that person is taking the knife out of his pocket. Okay, I don't know if you heard the one officer. He's saying, I don't know what you have in your hands. I don't know what you have in your hands. He knows, he saw that this person went inside of his pocket. He knew that he was taking something out of his pocket. At that moment, he wasn't real clear what it was, but he knew that it was something that was, in all likelihood, some sort of weapon to be used against the officers. And he's trying to alert the officers that this person has, in fact, taken something out of his pocket.
Watch out! Move! Get back! Back up! Back up! Back up! Don't worry about it. Put it down! Put it down! 201, shots fired. Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Hurry up! Put the knife down now! 201, shots fired. Put the knife down! Put the knife down! Choice is yours! Choice is yours! Choice is yours! Put the knife down! Put it down! Put it down now! I want to run to aid! Put the knife down! Put the knife down! Put the knife down! Put the knife down, sir!
The officer is saying, I want to render aid. He's trying to de-escalate it even more. His thought process at that point is, despite the horrific thing that this person did to the officer, he still wanted to get this person the necessary medical attention that the person needed. Other thing, too, I wanted to make note of is, I don't know if you heard in the background, the officer is saying, I need a tourniquet. I've been cut. And so it was at that point where the officer actually sustained his wound. So this last video that I'll show you will be it mostly slow motion, and that's where you'll really be able to see now the events as they unfolded, and you'll be able to see the knife. You'll be able to see the person's actions in slow motion, how close that person got to slicing the officer, slicing or stabbing that officer in the head area during this encounter.
How do I have the warrant? I don't have the warrant. I can't offer for this. I'm like, if I'm there being incarcerated, I'm not being unruly or anything. That's our policy. I'm not going to cuffs. How you gonna go to a police station now and not cuffs? Why am I going to police station? What is the warrant for? This is nothing to do with her. This is. No, I know that. That's why I'm asking. What is the warrant for? We're gonna go clear it up. That's the warrant for. Just be quiet. Criminal obstruction of breathing. Bro, I just came from Schenectady County for that reason. You just released me. That was 3 months ago. I'm not going to no cuffs for that again. You're going to have to kill me. I'm not. I'm telling you, I just wait for that and they let me go through the judge. Bro, you want to make a phone call. I'm not going that way. Bro, I'm not going to cuffs.
So you can see there in his right hand, you see the knife. Now, at this point, he's already been shot, and you can see he's still in attack mode on the officer, and in fact, he will attempt to stab the officer a second time, and watch how close he gets to the officer's head this second time. And stop it there, Steve. And when I mentioned yesterday about the extraordinary amount of restraint that was used by the officer that fired the weapon, this is an example of that. This person had just made a second assault against this officer, inches away from that officer's head with that weapon, was making no indication that he was stopping the assault. And that officer, at that moment, and maybe even shortly before this moment that you're seeing right now, would have been justified in continuing lethal force in order to stop an assault. This officer had the conscious awareness at this point to understand that maybe there's a different way that this can be resolved. Although I may be justified in using lethal force at this moment because this is an armed subject who is still in assault mode against an officer, I'll try something different. And I'll try to de-escalate this even more. Under an extremely tense circumstances, extremely emotional circumstances, it's hard to imagine what's going through the head of this officer right now. You know, he saw this person pull a weapon, pull a knife out of his pocket. He's trying to alert the other officers that this guy has something. I don't know what. And then he watches this guy stab his fellow officer, and then try to stab this fellow officer a second time, and yet he still has the conscious awareness to understand that other forms of de-escalation at this point can be used, although I may be yet justified at this point in continuing lethal force. Go ahead, Steve.
Stop! Stop! Put the knife down! Put the knife down! Put the knife down!
So, 16 seconds from the time that those officers put hands on that subject, when he put his hands inside of the pocket in his sweatshirt, it was 16 seconds from that point until they were de-escalating and attempting to get that person to go down and release his weapon. So, again, this shows just the difficulties of policing. It's not always like this, but these officers, in many cases, are put into situations where they have to make decisions in seconds. Decisions on whether or not to use lethal force. Life-saving decisions within seconds. And in this case, they had 16 seconds to save a fellow officer and de-escalate a situation. So I'm ready to take any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
Do you have the man's name and whether he's been formally charged yet?
We have not, we're not releasing his name now because he has not been arraigned, and I don't have information at this point as to when he actually will be. But I fully anticipate that this person will be charged with this incident.
Can you talk about the efforts you guys made, like crowds gathered after the shooting last night and last night?
Yeah, it's always a tense situation. You know, anytime there's an officer-involved shooting or any type of use of force with officers, whether it's justified or not, I mean, it creates anxiety and tension within our community. Now, I'm confident, though, that we've done a lot over the years in terms of building relationships with members of our community. So despite there being some concern when things like this happen, and despite there being a level of anxiety, and in some cases there may even be anger on the part of some people, I think the vast majority of the people within our community understand that when we have incidents like this, that we need to wait until the facts come out. And I think the vast majority of the people of this community understand that if things are not done right, then there will be consequences. You know, we hold our people accountable. But it's also important for the community to know that when officers do the right things, that we support them. You know, these are some extremely difficult and challenging circumstances to be in. And again, I said this yesterday, we're dealing with human beings, although highly trained human beings, and you put in a position where within seconds you have to make a life or death decision. I mean, it's difficult for anybody. And we've got these young men and women who are out there that have to do this. I mean, this is, to me, this is conclusive evidence that, you know, these officers, under the circumstances, performed at a very, very high level. And quite frankly, I'm very, very proud of the way those officers handled this situation from the very start until the very end, rendering aid. We heard this officer, after there was an officer-involved shooting, after this person had brutally stabbed an officer, tried to kill a fellow officer, you had an officer who tells him, "Put your weapon down because I want to render aid." I mean, how professional is that under such stressful conditions?
Was that officer able to render aid before other responding officers came to the scene?
Not until other officers came and not until he released his weapon. This person had already demonstrated that he wanted to kill or severely injure an officer. And so we wanted to make sure that it was safe for any responding officers to render aid to do so. And but the intent was absolutely there. You know, he's very clear. Drop your weapon. I want to render aid. And in fact, when he dropped his weapon and released it, aid was immediately rendered to that person.
Chief, you seem to indicate that whatever incident your officers were referring to for a warrant that had been cleared up out of Schenectady County. Is there any clarification whether those are two separate incidents or are they the same?
I believe he was getting it confused with something else. The warrant that we were referring to, that we explained to him very calmly and very cordially in a very non-confrontational way, that is a warrant out of our city. And it's a valid warrant. And, you know, he's clearly told that. And, you know, had he simply complied with the commands for the officers, I mean, we wouldn't be at this point. You know, those officers did exactly what they were supposed to do. You know, when we're in situations like that, we check as a routine matter, you know, does the person have any warrants or holds? If they don't, then we move on and we get the person out of there. But if they do, then, you know, these officers have a duty and an obligation to take that person into custody so he can be held accountable for whatever was happening. And that's all these officers were doing. I mean, it's just a routine arrest that this person escalated.
During a routine arrest, at what point are officers supposed to ask the person if they have any weapons, drugs, anything they're not supposed to have on?
It could be at any time, but there's no standard, in other words, is what I'm saying. You know, it can be at any time. You know, these officers have discretion, obviously, and, you know, as a general matter, we don't walk up to people and ask them, do you have weapons on you? I mean, it's, you know, if we see you walking down the street and we have some encounter with you, I mean, it's not just a general thing that we ask. Now, in a situation like this, you know, we knew that the person had a warrant. We're trying to de-escalate the situation, you know, and you know, these officers made a judgment call as to how they interacted with this person and how they interviewed this person. But you know, the critical piece for me is that these officers were simply trying to let this person know that he had an open warrant. You heard the officer say, let's just go clear this up. You know, this is the information I have. The system says you have a warrant. You saying that you don't, let's clear it up. If the system is wrong, then you're released and you go on with your life. But this person, for whatever reason, decided to resolve this, whatever dispute he had in his mind regarding this, by stabbing an officer and trying to kill an officer. You know, so I'm, you know, whether the officers asked before or after whether or not he had a weapon, you know, to me that's not an important piece as I'm reviewing this. You know, the critical piece is you have a person who decided to stab and try to kill an officer for an officer just carrying out a routine matter, and a matter that I want to emphasize was non-confrontational up until that point. And in fact, the officers were trying to de-escalate this person, knowing that he was a little tense and a little anxious in the events leading up to that.
And Chief, I have two questions.
Yes.
You guys handle domestic violence calls. I know it can be somewhat tense. Do you guys have, I guess, special training when you're going to handle these calls? And then my second question was just asking the status of the officer that was injured.
The officer that was injured, he sustained a very serious wound. Again, there was significant blood loss, and so you have the physical piece of it, but then you have the mental part of it, where this officer knew that he was within inches of being maimed for life or killed. And so when you're in a situation like that, in many cases, the mental piece is the more difficult part to overcome. And so I spoke with him yesterday, and his spirits are high. You know, he understands that he has support from the police department, from the city, from members of our community, and he's doing well. In terms of the training that our officers get, we have constant training on how to deal with domestic violence incidents, because we know from experience in law enforcement that domestic violence calls are some of the most dangerous calls that an officer can go on. When you statistically look at the officer deaths by officers in the line of duty, we consistently see that deaths during domestic violence incidents rank very high, year after year. You know, they're so emotional, they're so volatile, and then you have officers who are called to try to diffuse those situations. And I think those officers, under those circumstances, did an outstanding job of arriving in a very volatile situation, diffusing it at the very outset, by the fact that they were there for almost an hour and they were helping this person take things out of the apartment. That's how much they had diffused and de-escalated that situation. And you even heard the guy say on video, he said, I haven't done anything yet, or I haven't done anything, I've been cooperative. And that's because those officers set a tone when they arrived at that scene during a call that is traditionally one of the most dangerous that officers can arrive and deal with. So I'm very, very proud of how they handled that under those stressful conditions. But to answer your questions, we get quite a bit of training because we know that those are some of the more dangerous incidents to deal with.
And is the officer still in the hospital, or is he out?
The officer has been released, and he's home now.
Wait, two more questions?
Sounds like a career-long criminal. Can you give us a little rep on this guy's background?
You know, I didn't bring my sheet with me that details it all, but yesterday, or I can have the public information officer get that for you, but several contacts at the felony level with this person. And obviously he had the open warrant out of our city, and so he's very well known to law enforcement, and again has had several contacts. All right, thank you. Oh, yeah, okay.